Hey, welcome to Lectures from the Desk. This is James Tippins. I am unbound. You can learn more about what I do at the autonomycommission.com and jamestippins.com. I've been talking about the different masks that I have identified, and today I want to talk about one that is going to be a little controversial for some of us. And also, I'm going to give more time to it from a biblical standpoint, and from a standpoint of just religion and faith. But I want to begin with a distinction that is important enough to name before anything else, because without it, this lecture can be misread, okay? I'm not talking about faith today. And so in that sense, I want you to understand that. I'm not talking about spirituality or religious practice or the deep and genuine human need for connection to something larger, okay? Those things are real and they matter, but they're not what I'm describing. I'm talking about the performance of these things, the version of faith that's organized not around genuine connection, but around the management of identity, the spiritual life that has become at its structural core a more sophisticated and difficult to examine mask, and really more than the others, precisely because it wraps itself in the language of virtue and surrender and service and love and God. The religion mask is the identity that says, if I'm spiritually correct, I'm acceptable. If I perform the faith correctly, I'm safe. If I maintain the image of the devoted one, the servant, the surrendered one, the pious one, the one who has it all together spiritually, then I am the thing I am most afraid of, which is being seen as an ordinary or compromised or spiritually inadequate person. Then we don't know what to do, right? We really get to this place of going, okay, if I maintain this image, then I'm safe. I'm connected. I'm okay. All right? On the other side, it's important to understand and to say that this mask doesn't appear in every religious or spiritually inclined person. Genuine faith is not a mask. Genuine surrender, genuine service, devotion that flows from something real rather than something from the anxiety of performance is not what I'm describing. The mask is specifically the version of spiritual life that's being used to construct and maintain an identity rather than to express one. Okay? The origin is usually a community, almost always, because the religion mask is specifically a social mask. It doesn't, in my experience, it has never really formed in isolation. It forms in environments where belonging and love and approval and worth are communicated through spiritual performance. So where the good one, the faithful one, the one who serves the most and doubts the least and shows up most reliably and talks about God the most fluently and accurately is the one who receives the warmest reception from the community that matters most in their life. So in that environment, a person learns something true and makes a false conclusion about what the learning means. What they learn is, here in this community, spiritual performance produces belonging. What they conclude is, my worth in relation to God and others is contingent on my spiritual performance. The first sentence is an accurate reading of the social environment. The second sentence is a theological error with an identity built on top of it. And the person inside of that identity, they really often can't see the error because the community they are most embedded in continually and actively reinforces that. Let's talk about this texture, this performance right now, what it looks like. I'm going to describe what the religion mask looks like in daily experience because it has specific features that are worth naming with precision. The first feature is the spiritual audit, a running internal assessment of whether one's spiritual life is meeting whatever standard is there. The standard is usually drawn from the community, though it is experienced as personal, right? It includes visible markers like attendance, service giving, language, and invisible markers like the quality of one's prayer life, the presence or absence of doubt, the consistency of spiritual disciplines, and the degree to which one's interior experience matches the language being used on the outside in public. And the audit is really never satisfied. Why? Because a performance can always be better. And a performance that is always capable of being better is almost always capable of being inadequate. The second feature is doubt as threat. For a person whose spiritual identity is organized around performance and correctness, genuine doubt is not an experience to be held and examined. It's a crisis to be resolved as quickly as possible because doubt changes the performance. It introduces the possibility that the identity is built on something less certain than it needs to be. And so the religion mask person develops, often without even noticing it, a sophisticated set of mechanisms for suppressing, redirecting, or quickly resolving doubt before it has a chance to do the work that genuine spiritual development requires it to do. Doubt is necessary. The irony of this is significant. The suppression of doubt in most serious theological traditions is not considered spiritual maturity. It's considered spiritual avoidance and immaturity. The willingness to sit with uncertainty, that is, to hold the tension of questions that do not resolve quickly, to remain present to a God who cannot be managed or predicted, is usually considered among the most demanding and most genuine forms of faith. The religion mask inverts this. It makes certainty the performance standard and doubt the evidence of failure. And in doing so, it produces a version of spiritual life that is literally less connected to genuine faith than the uncertainty it's trying to prevent. The third feature is the curated testimony. I don't want to gag right now live on air, so I'll just keep talking. A person wearing the religion mask has developed, usually over years of practice in community settings, a version of their spiritual story that has been edited for the audience. Not dishonestly. The events described are real, but the selection of events, the framing, the language, all of that has been calibrated for maximum spiritual credibility within the community. The failures are included, but they're included in the right way, the way that produces admiration for the person's honesty and confirmation of the community's theology. The doubts are included, but in the past tense. They're resolved. Evidence of growth rather than ongoing experience. The real inner space, the interior life, the parts that are still unresolved, complicated, in tension with the theology or theological commitments of the community, they stay off stage. This curated testimony is not lying, but it is, in every stinking sense, a performance. And the gap between curated and actual, it widens over time as the person's real life grows more complex. It can eventually become one of the most isolating experiences available because the community that the person is most embedded in is the community that receives only the curated version. And the price of that community's belonging is the continued maintenance of that performance and of a performance that has grown increasingly disconnected from what is actually true. I digress. The fourth feature is spiritual entitlement. This one is the least examined and the most dangerous. A person who has organized their identity around spiritual performance develops over time a quiet expectation that the performance should produce certain outcomes. Not outcomes they would openly claim as entitlement, but outcomes they experience visceral injustice about when these things don't appear, when they don't arrive. That's what I'm trying to say. So the faithful person who suffers in this way, they suffer unexpectedly. They're like, oh, wow, what's happened? The devoted servant who is overlooked, the one who's done everything right, starts to encounter a life that doesn't respond accordingly. The religion masked person experiences these moments not merely as painful, but as violations of an invisible contract, because at the structural level of the identity, the performance was supposed to produce protection. And when it doesn't protect, what surfaces is not just grief. It's a kind of fury that the person can't always name or is deeply ashamed of because it implies that their devotion was not at its root free. Now, I want to say something about the theological consequence of the religion mask because I think it's important and I think it's underexamined even in communities that talk extensively about spiritual formation. A person who has built their identity around spiritual performance has, at the center of that identity, a particular kind of God. a God who is primarily a standard to be met rather than a presence to be known, a God whose primary function in the person's life is to provide the theological framework within which the performance is evaluated, a God who approves the good stuff, the spiritual showing, and withdraws in the face of the inadequate one, a God who, in other words, is organized around the same structure as every other mask, conditional acceptance. And I'm not making a theological argument about the nature of God. What I'm pointing to is that the God a person actually relates to functionally in their daily experience is often a projection of their identity structure. And a person whose identity structure is organized around performance and conditional acceptance will, regardless of what they say their theology is, they will relate to God primarily through the lens of a performance standard. The theological language may be grace. Oh, I should talk about this more. But the functional experience is audit. And this creates a spiritual life that is, in the deepest sense, absolutely abandoned and lonely. Because the God who is approached through performance is not able to be approached in the moments when the performance has failed. Cannot be brought the parts of oneself that have not yet been made spiritually presentable. Cannot be trusted with the inner space or interior life that is too raw and too real and too honest to be allowed into the community context. The God of the mask is always watching, and he's paying close attention to the performance. And the person underneath the performance, the one who has doubts and rage and confusion and desire and grief that does not fit the framework, they have never fully arrived in that relationship because the relationship was not built to hold them. The religion mask, at its most defended, produces a person who is surrounded by the language of intimacy with God and profoundly alone in the actual experience of it. That's why so many people seek certain types of affinities in their worship. And the loneliness cannot be named in the community because naming it would challenge the performance that the community requires. So the person gets better and better and better at performing. And the actual interior life goes further and further underground until something happens, until the years accumulate, like my own, enough weight, and the performance can no longer be maintained at the cost it is requiring. And the crisis that follows is often described from the outside as a loss of faith. But from the inside, it is almost always something different. It is the moment the performance fails. And underneath the failure is a person who has never known whether there was anything real beneath it. I want to describe then, in contrast, what genuine spiritual life looks like when it is not organized around performance. And I have a personal story of this, 29 years of it. But I won't go there today. Just stay tuned. I want to talk about what it looks like when there's no performance here. Not to prescribe a theology, but to describe the quality of experience that becomes available when the mask is no longer doing the work. The first quality, I could teach an hour on this, is honesty with God. Whatever your theology, whatever your tradition, the version of spiritual life that is not organized around performance is one in which the actual interior experience, inner space, is brought unedited into the spiritual relationship. The doubt, the anger, the desire, the confusion, the desires that don't fit the framework, the grief that has not resolved, the questions that have been living underground because they weren't safe to bring into the community. This honesty is not irreverence. In virtually every serious spiritual tradition, this kind of raw, unmanaged encounter with the divine is considered the deepest form of relationship available. The Psalms prove what I'm saying. The mystics describe it extensively. The most honest spiritual autobiographies are built on it, and the religion mask is the thing that prevents it. The second quality is the belonging without performance. This is what becomes available in a spiritual community when the person stops curating their testimony. Not the abandonment of discernment about what is shared and with whom, but the experience of being in a community where a degree of genuine presence is allowed and embraced, where the complicated and a little bit dirty parts of life can be brought without producing rejection or concern, where the belonging is not contingent on the maintenance of a spiritual image or language. This kind of community is rarer than it should be. But when a person has experienced it, even for just a short time, the contrast with performing community is immediate and unmistakable. The third quality is service from fullness rather than from need. A person who has separated from that religion mask does not stop serving. In many cases, their service becomes more effective because the service is no longer organized around the community's recognition of that service. It becomes instead a genuine expression of something that lives in them. And so the giving then is free. It doesn't carry this invisible contract and expectation of the contract. It does not require the recognition to remain intact. It is offered and then released. And there's a particular freedom in this that people who have experienced it describe in similar terms. The freedom of giving without needing the giving to confirm your worth, of being in a community without needing the community's approval to remain steady, of bringing your actual self into a spiritual context and finding perhaps for the very first time that the actual self is the thing that the relationship was always for. The religion mask made you the good one. The real one is the only one who ever actually prays. The real one is the only one who can be genuinely met. And the real one has been there the entire time, underneath the performance, waiting not for permission, but for the moment when the performance costs more than the identity behind it could justify. That moment is available. And it begins with a willingness to bring what is true, actually true, into the room, regardless of the cost, regardless of whether the room initially knows what to do with it. Because a God who can only be approached through performance is a God you have never actually met, and he's a fraud. And the one underneath the mask deserves to find out if that is true. Pay attention, because I'm just getting started. My name is James, and this is Unbound. Talk to you soon.